I'm going to introduce Arthur. Arthur is a local historian on subjects of political and military history. He was a professional curator of and the technical director of exhibits at the Intrepid. He is currently a counselor and certified senior advisor who offers pro bono services to those who are returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. Welcome, Arthur.
Hi, how are you? Are we all set to go? All right, thank you very much. Thank you for joining me for another hour and a half of discussion. And this is the second part of our series, the election of 1860. And what I'm going to do, if you know, those of you who have been with me before, my presentation style is to put historical events in some kind of a context so we can understand them in contemporary terms, and not to change the meaning of them as we would judge them from contemporary terms, but really for you and I to go back in time and understand events as they occurred while they were occurring, to whatever degree it's possible for us to do that. And it is possible. So we have right now, for instance, you and I are citizens of our country, our communities, the world, perhaps, if you will. And there's a certain amount of political goings on around us, things that we see on the news, certain political trends, one way or the other, people who feel very, very strongly about one ideological point of view, and others on the other side who feel very strongly about an opposing ideological point of view. And we are no different than anybody else from any other time period, I think. If you and I were living during the time of the revolution, we would be creatures of that era. And if we were living during the time of 1860, we would be creatures of that era. So we're going to go back today and see what was going on in our country in the not only during the election of 1860, but for a period of time before that, to understand the feelings and the motivations of those who lived in that era that led to the Civil War, which is the point of our discussion. Now, it's true that the election of 1860 was a tipping point. And the question is, why is something a tipping point? Just like if you can consider the word tipping point or the phrase tipping point to be sort of like the last straw, you see. So if you've got the last straw, it implies that there were a lot of straws before that, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back. All right, and that's what the election of 1860 was. So what I want to discuss with you today is what all those other straws were that people on both sides, in the North and the South, felt was the last straw, and what actually led to the South seceding from the Union, which is where our lecture will end today. And that was in the end part of 1860. And of course, the Civil War begins in proper in April of 1861. So I've got a list here, a handwritten list that I wrote. I wrote two lists. I wrote this list for us today, and I wrote a grocery list, which I'm going to be using right after our lecture today. I won't bother you with the second list. The election of 1860 was considered a revolution. And the revolution was, if you're a Southerner, you looked at the election of 1860 and you said, well, the North has just done something to provoke us Southerners. And really, if you're a Southerner back then, you would be looking at that provocation of Abraham Lincoln being elected as president of the United States in 1860. You would be seeing yourself as somebody who wanted to secede from the Union. You're not creating a revolution. All you're doing is reacting to the North's revolution. You see, this is very important to understand. See, just like today, you know, anytime you're on two different sides of an argument, you know, presumably you're invested in your side of the argument to the point where probably if you get emotional enough about it, you think the other person is so wrong, the other cause is so wrong, that not only are they just mistaken, but their entire point of view needs to be banished, because not only is it wrong, it's evil. You see, and it's a danger to me, it's a threat to me. So I am in my own right to be angry and want to react. See, it wasn't me that started this, it was you that started this. We're only reacting to your irrationality and your emotionality. And it was exactly that way then, as it is with many things, I'm sure you'll agree today. Depending on what you listen to, what your sources of information are, the way you were raised, your education, your, I don't know, I guess your socioeconomic class standing. And of course, a discussion like this wouldn't be complete in the year 2021 without talking about the latest category of what you're supposed to make you think the way you think, which is race. Okay, I don't happen to subscribe to that last one, but I have to include it because a lot of people do. Now, for those of you who just came in, the point was that the election of 1860, electing Abraham Lincoln as the president of the United States, was considered by the South to be a terrific provocation, like a declaration of war practically. And I'll get to the details in all of this in a minute. We're starting with the broad strokes. And then the South about saying, well, now that you've elected Abraham Lincoln and this is what that means, we have no choice but to secede from the Union, starting with South Carolina. And then the North, of course, felt, well, you can't do that. So you're forcing us to go to war with you. I mean, that's the way that works. Now, by the time of the Civil War, our country had, despite the Constitution and all, had really developed into two different cultures, right? And roughly speaking, and it's a very broad characterization, but for the standpoint of our discussion, I'm going to use it. The North felt one way about stuff, and the South felt a different way about stuff. And it wasn't completely the case. There were people in the South who felt like we should keep the Union together. And there were people in the North who felt like, you know, they have absolutely no problem with slavery whatsoever, you see. So it is not an absolute thing, but from the standpoint of our discussion, let's go with that. Now, what has made in a short amount of time the North a completely different country, practically, culturally, than the South? That is a very large point of our discussion today. You know, if you look at today's world, if you follow politics and you teach politics, I do these things all the time. I was giving a lecture on Monday on, you know, things like critical race theory and that sort of a thing. So obviously there are people who agree with that and people who don't agree with that. So, and both sides feel very strongly about it and threatened by the other side, right? Well, this is the situation we had prior to the Civil War as well. The North was perceiving the South to be a threatening thing by the way that they lived their lives and wanted to hold their society, and vice versa. All right, now I'll get into the details. I'm starting with some broad strokes here. It wasn't just a big unified country that all of a sudden somebody decided to shoot somebody else, and next thing you know, there was a war. It wasn't that at all. Two different nations, two different economic systems. Not only that, but in Congress, you have those people who were afraid that they were going to lose power to the other side, who of course were going to empower our federal government with, if we lose, the other side is going to empower the federal government to do things that we absolutely abhor, right? You'll see that look no further than turn on the news today if you want to. And you'll see that there's a massive power struggle in the halls of Congress in our government about, well, if these people get their way, they're going to pass this enormous bill, for instance, and they're not doing it with any Republicans, they're only doing it with Democrats if that should happen. And that just goes to show you how polarized things are. I'm not taking a position on it, I'm just giving you an example from the current news. So you can see that 100%, obviously one side wants to do something and the other side 100% doesn't want to do it. They think it's a danger, you see. And the other side that wants to do it thinks it's a danger that the other side doesn't want to do it, right? That's exactly what we have. And that's exactly the situation it was by 1860. In one of the largest running arguments we've had in our country has been about what's usually referred to as Hamilton versus Jefferson. And Hamilton versus Jefferson. This has to do with the way that our republic runs from the standpoint of federalism, right? Which is a divided government between the Washington, D.C., and also a parallel governance between the states. You see, so Hamilton versus Jefferson had different viewpoints, and they've kind of become the polar representatives of one point of view towards the other. And we'll start with this in detail. Now, Hamilton, I'm going to oversimplify this for the standpoint of our time. Hamilton felt as though people could be smart, but they tended to be a little bit on the immoral side and needed help. And so therefore, a large, benevolent, paternal government, central government, was the way to go. And Jefferson, on the other hand, felt as though that people were inherently good and had the power to be redeemed if they were wrong, to power to transcend their current ignorance or whatever it was that they did wrong that made them guilty of something. And so that they're inherently good and have the capacity to govern themselves, you see. Now, like I said, that's slightly an oversimplification, but you know what? It's a good oversimplification. And you can see a constant thread of that right through the entire governance of our country, right to this present day. Do you believe in a paternalistic, centralized government that's there for your benefit, even though they're interfering in every single thing you're doing, not just as an individual, but in your state governments and making the states subservient to the federal government, right? That would have been Hamilton's point of view. Jefferson's point of view was that it was the states that are sovereign governments by themselves, with their own unique characters, almost like little countries. And it was the states that created the federal government, and therefore the federal government is subservient to the states and should remain so. So you can see the tension in this, and you can see it play out any day that you're watching television or reading the news or however you get your information, whatever side you feel like. Most of the people I know around the Northeast, where I've spent my entire life, tend to feel like Hamilton does. You know, like the federal government is the way to go as far as the greater good. And therefore, states and individuals within the state and organizations within the states should become eventually some form of subservient to the federal government. And you saw that expand quite a bit in the 20th century under various progressive presidents like Wilson and, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So there's always been this tension, right? Except in our modern era, we talk about communism, which has been around for a long time. Certainly throughout the 20th century, it became a threat, or at least a perceived threat to the United States of America. And anytime you had somebody with a Hamiltonian point of view, it was, well, you want a centralized government, and that kind of smacks of socialism or communism, if you will. So there's that overlap as well, right? Now, I'm not going to go further into that part of it. I just wanted to point that out. Some of the things that are on my list here are the things that went on in the early 1800s that were eventually right up to the Civil War, right? The Second Great Awakening, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Missouri Compromise, the Mexican-American War, Dred Scott decision, Uncle Tom's Cabin, John Brown's Rebellion, and the creation of the Republican Party. You have some technological things too that added a little bit of speed to what was happening, or at least information getting around. Or you might also say anywhere there's information, there is, as we would say today, misinformation, or maybe fake news, if you want. And that would be, remember, the invention of the telegraph was there. I mean, the Civil War, we were telegraphing messages back and forth in, virtually real time at this point. And that was something that never existed before. And then the American public was greatly influenced about what was being reported, right? Which brings us to, of course, something that's been with us today and in the past, which is the press, right? So when I say that we have had two different nations by the time the Civil War came up, it really was. It really was. The North had become increasingly industrialized and urbanized, right? Now, I was born in New York City, and I went to school to large measure my graduate degree and worked in Manhattan for many years, and was around a lot of people and a lot of friends. And when you're from a place like New York, at least when I was there, and the people I was with, I don't want to overpaint this, you're kind of proud and you have a sense of esprit de corps that you're living in a sophisticated place with sophisticated people, and you believe in sophisticated things. And so what is that sophistication? And the urbanism that went along with that had, some measure of self-identification as a good thing. And of course, a good thing would be in comparison to what? People who weren't urbanized, people who weren't sophisticated, you see? And back in these days, before the Civil War, the North looked down at the South, and, what did the North see? You had an economy that was agrarian almost exclusively. Large plantations, crops of things like tobacco, rice, cotton, and a slave society that made it possible for this aristocracy of slave owners to exist. You see, so if you're an urban person who is in kind of like, when I was younger, we called it the melting pot of all of these things, it's kind of like an equalizer, at least amongst people who looked a certain way. And let's make it clear that in the North, it wasn't like people in the North weren't racists. They were racists. There was people in the North didn't want there to be Black people to be equal to them, or maybe sitting down and having the same job across the desk as you are, getting paid the same thing as you are. So it's one thing being for abolition of slavery. It's another thing about having Black people be your equal, right? So it's very, very important to understand that. So what made people, up in arms about this? Well, we were always up in arms about it, sort of, even during the times of the Revolutionary War. It was understood by people, or maybe aspirationally praying and hoping that it would be the case, that slavery was just going to burn itself out like a log in the fireplace that had expended everything that there is to burn, and then just be there as a charred piece of charcoal. You see? I mean, people were just hoping it was going to go away. That kind of like progress of the world was going to make slavery unsustainable. And if you were here the last time, you had heard me talk about the revolution, where the Declaration of Independence, to get all 13 colonies on board, because it had to be unanimous, the Declaration of Independence, or it would have given Great Britain too much of a lever to separate us, North and South, or whatever, whoever didn't agree to the Declaration of Independence, it would have been too easy to break us. We had to be unanimous. But the only way it could be unanimous is for the Declaration of Independence to have no mention of slavery, you see? So therefore, it would have been acceptable to the Southern states. And this actually happened. Thomas Jefferson had a clause in the Declaration of Independence wanting to renounce slavery. And it had to be edited out if the Southern states were going to be signing the Declaration of Independence. You see, so that was what we call taking a half a loaf instead of no loaf, and we'll fix the rest later. Well, everything that our course is about here is later. This is the later. They kicked the can down the road because they had to. And that brings us only to 50 years later. Less than 50 years later, when all of this is coming to a head gradually, and then all of a sudden. The Southern states had developed a different culture, a different set of values, a different way of living than the Northern states. It couldn't have been more opposite. We were all Americans. We all were deeply covetous of what the Declaration of Independence and American freedom had given us. It was just that it was a different way to perceive that freedom. You know, the Southern states did not want to be bothered. They didn't want an overbearing federal government telling it what to do, which was always the fear of a centralized government. And remember, going back to the revolutionary discussion, what is the point of creating a federal government that the Constitution created if we're going to wind up with an overbearing centralized power that's no different than the monarchy of Great Britain? I mean, what was the point? The point is for us to have our freedom, our states to have their freedom, our individuals to have their freedom. You know, and obviously, if you're in the South, that means you can have your freedom as long as you're not a Black person, or B, a woman. All right. So there you go. But people didn't look at it that way back then. It was more of a custom. You know, it wasn't like people in other parts of the world had this big emancipation movement on. We were actually right in line with, if left alone, we probably would have been right in line with the other abolition movements that occurred. We had our own way of dealing with it. And that way became leading up to and the Civil War. How do you handle states that are coming into the Union? This becomes a big pile of those straws that eventually broke the camel's back, right? You've got the original 13 colonies, and now you've got things happening like the Louisiana Purchase, and you have all of this other expansion west. And as new states were being requesting to come into the Union, the federal government had to decide whether or not they were going to be free states or slave states. And this becomes a large issue, a very large issue. In the early 1800s, the South still had a tremendous amount of power in Congress. But it was clear as more states were added to the Union, if those states were going to be only conditionally allowed to become part of the Union if they were non-slave holding states, then it was clear to see, if you were from the South, and you wanted to maintain this way of living, that you would soon be outnumbered in Congress. And then the federal government would have the authority to essentially, you'd be surrounded, and then they would force you to be a non-slaveholding state, you see? So you had to, if you were in the South, figure out a way to make it more equitable for the states joining the Union to at least be equal about one state will be a slaveholding state, one state will be a free state, right? I mean, at least that would be equal. Or maybe they should decide for their own. The people of the new state should decide for their own whether or not they're going to hold slaves or not hold slaves, which would mean that you had the power to go there and advocate for your cause. And whoever has the best propaganda machine, okay, and the biggest clubs, and who is more corrupt, can gain the power and force that state to be a slaveholding state or a non-slaveholding state. You see, kind of like frontier justice, if you will. All right, and these are the things that were happening. And there was really never a resolution to it. The first try was the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri was added as a slave state, and then you had simultaneously Maine added in Upper New England as a free state. You see, so that seemed at least 50-50, right? And then after that, you had the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was this other big deal, which led, especially in Kansas, to the situation I was telling you about, where the idea was for Kansas to be able to determine, you know, by its own election system, what was going to happen in that state. So you had all of these people from Missouri coming into Kansas, and you virtually had a civil war before the Civil War even started. Something usually referred to by historians as Bloody Kansas, where you had all of these people coming into Kansas, and Kansas was going to be the focal point where the war was fought about whether or not Kansas was going to flip to the left or it was going to flip to the right. And so what you had was a lot of people from the South came up into Kansas, and they would stake a claim saying, well, I have a right to vote in Kansas on this issue because I am claiming this patch of land right over here next to this tree. And that's all you had to do. And you'd write it down, and it didn't matter if you were lying or not, you probably were, then you got to vote, you see? And consequently, you had all these people from the North coming down who were anti-slavery, and they were doing the same thing so they could counteract the vote of the pro-slavery people. You see, so Kansas became filled with all of these people who didn't really live there. For the 5 minutes of taking the vote, they had a stake of a land claim, and it became this thing. And of course, that turned into bloodshed and conflict, and all kinds of people's heads getting bashed in, and it was a big, big problem. This was all before the Civil War. It was like a civil war before the Civil War, and for the exact same reasons. So the Southern people wanted to preserve their lifestyle, and they felt threatened. They didn't want to lose their entire economic system to these people in the North. And the Southern people felt as though they were more virtuous, right? They lived in a way that was the high point of what people came to North America for, to take European civilization without the politics and without the bad stuff of societies fighting with each other and kings and queens for hundreds and hundreds of years and the Crusades and everything else. And we are going to have like a utopia here of Western values. And that's what the Southern plantation owners thought that they had achieved. Whereas the people in the North, the ones that I was telling you about, saw themselves as virtuous, those who lived in the cities and all the rest of that. The people in the South looked to the Northerners as these corrupt commercialists who had lost their soul. living in these urban environments, and they had no values, and they lived a very fast-paced life, and they were being mechanized by the mechanical revolution to, work in factories, and they had lost their soul, and everything was the almighty dollar. You see, so the Southern people felt as though they were more virtuous, their lifestyle was worth defending, etc. And slavery was part of that. So who were the Northern abolitionists? They weren't the people who were necessarily the industrialists, right? There was a whole thing going on as far as a movement in this country, especially in the North, that had the same kind of fervor that we see today in today's movements, right? Things that are emotional, things that people feel moral about, you see? If you're watching television, I don't know, today, if you want, you've got, what's his name? Kyle Rittenhouse, right? And there are people outside the Kenosha courthouse, and they're holding signs that says, lock him up. And the other people are saying, he had a right to be there and he was practicing self-defense. Now, it's safe to say that people who are one side or the other of this particular argument are quite passionate about that argument. You see, they feel morally invested in their side of the argument. And because they feel morally invested in their side of the argument, the person who represents the other side of the argument by default must be amoral or immoral. You see, so that's what we're talking about here. That was the fervor in this country before the Civil War. One side felt like they were on the moral side of an issue, and the other side was obviously on the evil side of the issue, and it needed to be banished, needed to be eradicated because it was evil. So how do we get this kind of evil versus non-evil? This is not a rational civil discussion where we're talking about, things from a bullet point to bullet point to bullet point. What led up to the Civil War was a passion on both sides. How do people get passionate about these things? Well, you'd ask yourself, how do we get passionate about things? It's really the same thing, except our issues are the issues we have right now, and their issues were issues they had right then. But if you want to understand how this works, it's the same exact emotion, probably from the same reasons. It depends on where you live, how you were raised, as I was saying before, the things that you read, and the things that you believe in. The Second Great Awakening at the beginning of the 1800s had a lot to do with this. And we usually don't talk about these things, but it's important to talk about these things. You know me, I'm a sociological person. I like to see how individuals operate in groups, right? And you have to understand these things if you're going to understand how societies behave. And that's exactly where we're going with this right now. And the Second Great Awakening was like the spiritual revival, if you will. This almost like the birth of, I guess you would call it, evangelicalism, right? Where you had a sense where not just religion, but a person's ability to be personally saved. That occurred during this time. So you could be redeemed even if you were a wretch, right? Like the song and Amazing Grace, you could be redeemed. There was a big difference between religion before this and after this. I mean, we had the great, you had the Reformation, etc. But really this was the culmination of a person's ability to achieve whatever they could achieve via their gift from God. And the fact that you were born a sinner or you had been a sinner wasn't something that was going to mark you forever, because if you had cast aside your bad ways, well, you could effectually be born again. You see? And this came with an entire culture of thinking. Church attendance really bloomed during this era. and continued uniquely as far as a Western country is concerned in our country, right up until like the 1950s and the 1960s. And we're very unique in the United States in that regard. So you can't underestimate the power of this. Now, with this, call it evangelicalism if you want to, comes with a notion that is your job to evangelicalize, right? That means that it's not just enough for you to be good and to do good, right? But you had to export the word, you see. You know, around the turn of the last century, we had this term called the white man's burden, if you know what that is. And it means that people who are in this mode that I'm telling you have this belief system, as I was just describing it, you know, we look back on it now and we say, well, that was colonialism. But the people at the time were going off into far places in Africa and things like this. And I'm sure that, you know, I don't want to discount the fact that these peoples in Africa and I guess out in the Far East were being exploited, but at the same time, it was being done under the notion that we are bringing civilization to you. We are bringing medicine to you. We were bringing Christianity to you. We are doing what we're supposed to do by bringing the word to those who don't have it, you see. Now, of course, today we have a much different viewpoint of that. We say that, well, we exploited those people and we imported, without their asking us, our viewpoints on them, and we eradicated their entire culture in the process. But you see where I'm going with this? At the time, it seemed like they were doing the right thing for benevolent reasons. You see, now, the Second Great Awakening in our country had a lot to do with that in the form of eradicating slavery. It's really where the abolitionist movement really came up. I mean, there were always people who were saying, you know, this thing about having slaves and owning them as property doesn't really jive with the Declaration of Independence. It's not like that escaped people's notice. But the real emotional abolitionist movement came from people's feeling as these evangelicals that they had to go down to the South and they had to go to Kansas and see if they could stop this scourge. You see, so with this kind of emotionalism and this feeling like you were on the side of God or not on the side of God, it brought with it the sense that you were either good or you were evil, right? And that's a pretty binary thing. Either you're going to be good or you're going to be evil. Right. And obviously, if you're going to be good, then that means that the evil is something to be not tolerated. That's what we have now. And the Southern people who saw themselves as very pious people, well, they were like, who the hell are you to tell me that I'm evil? You know, go look in the mirror yourself and see what you're doing to the landscape up north, and the fact that your soul is sold to the highest profit margin and all the rest of that. You see, so this is the tension we have in the period before the Civil War. You know, so you could ask yourself the question, I mean, is the Civil War about slavery? And initially it wasn't. It was about this entire culture clash. Right? It was about this entire culture clash, and it was about politics. It was about, does the federal government have the right to come over to my state government, which is sovereign as the federal government, and tell us that we have to do this or we have to do that when it is not mentioned in the Constitution. The purpose of the Constitution is to delineate what the federal government is responsible for, and whatever it is not responsible for, in writing, automatically is the business of the individual state and no other. You see, and now the federal government is moralizing. They are trying to stack the deck. They're trying to create a situation where all of the states coming into the Union are going to be non-slave holding states, which obviously is going to mean the demise, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but certainly in 10 or 15 years, the entire demise of our entire economic and cultural system here. You see? So now you've got the southern states who are feeling wronged from a constitutional standpoint. And the South felt as though the North were the aggressors. It was the North who had broken the contract, the sacred contract of federalism between the central government, Washington, D.C. They had broken that covenant. And they have said that, yes, it's not in the Constitution that the federal government has authority over this, but we're taking authority over it, and we're going to be telling you what to do. And therefore, we're going to determine what your lifestyle is going to be, what you can and can't do, and we're going to make the southern states like the northern states, and by default. And the southern states wouldn't have any of it. They were rejecting the whole thing just on that premise alone. So when South Carolina seceded from the Union, they felt it was their right to decertify their ratification of the Constitution. And the reason why they felt it was their given right to de-ratify their signing of the Constitution, South Carolina, was because the North, or in Washington, D.C., had essentially broken the Constitution. They had broken that sacred covenant. So therefore, all bets are off now. That is where the Civil War started, right? I mean, Abraham Lincoln wasn't running on a platform to eradicate slavery. He wasn't running on that platform at all. You see? He didn't want to expand slavery into the federal territories, past the states that were already admitted into the Union, right? But it had the same portent, because like I said to you, if all of the new states from, Nebraska all the way to California, right? Not that California was California yet, was going to be potentially all free states, then the majority of states in the United States would be free states. And the power in Congress would favor the free states, which would eventually squash the Southeast. Okay, but Abraham Lincoln was not there to, after he was elected, he wasn't there to force the southern states to become free states, not at all. You see, but the implication was there. The implication was there. And just like in 1860, you could take a number of things in our own life today, and it might add a level of, a level of depth to what people were feeling back then. The southern states felt as though the northern states were trying to erase their form of life and actually just kind of like normalize Black people as your equal, which wasn't true. Right? And the northern states felt that the southern states were trying to bring slavery into the northern states, so then it would equalize this notion of if people in the northern states became slaveholders to the degree that the southern people were, then the people in the north, of course, would have no problem with slavery, you see? And that wasn't true either. Right, but it's what people think is going on, then they act emotionally on it. This is what was happening between the North and the South. Let's use an example. Like, let's say, for instance, we'll take two sides of one issue, right? We'll take the side of a woman's right to choose. Okay, I'll go straight for the juggler here. All right, a woman's right to choose. And so one side would say, we've been waiting for centuries to have the right to control our own bodies. All right, and it is the basis of a woman's independence is guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence and by the rights of man, or persons, if you will, to be able to control our bodies, right? Because if we can't control our bodies, that means it's like, well, here I am pregnant now, and I'm stuck with this guy I hate and everything, and I'm not allowed to get divorced, and all the rest of the things that came with it back in those days, right? So this is very, very important. And then the other side that would say, well, no, we're not trying to take your right to choose away. We just want to make it so that you're not allowed to have an abortion in the third trimester. That's all. It's common sense. As a matter of fact, polling says that most people are against having an abortion in the third trimester. So what's the problem? You see? Now, the side for pro-life would say, aha, I know what you're doing. You're going to chip away at the edges on Roe versus Wade and the rest of these things, and you're going to make it seem like it's just common sense and it's fine and everybody agrees to it. But really what you're trying to do is it's a Trojan horse so that you can explode the whole thing and that women will be back where they used to be with having no rights in this regard at all. Right? That's the kind of mistrust you had here. Aha, I know what you're doing. And I mean, on another opposite example would be, really to the same emotional effect, would be like the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment. Well, the Constitution says that I have the Second Amendment and, whatever, I'm allowed to have a gun. And so people are opposed to this would say, well, we don't want to take away your right to have a gun. We just want to increase these regulations around it, you see, so that we're making sure about this and we're making sure about that. And we're gonna, this, that, and the other thing. It's all common sense. Polling suggests that most people are in favor of this, right? So that the Second Amendment, pro-Second Amendment people going, aha, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to it's a Trojan horse. You're trying to get in so that eventually you can eradicate the Second Amendment or effectively neutralize it. And you're going to come here and you're going to label me a terrorist if I've got a gun, or you're going to take a gun, or you're going to make it a forced mandatory buyback. You see, which is the same thing in my mind as confiscation, that gun owner would say. I know what you're doing. You see the absolute mistrust of the other side on both of these issues? That is exactly what you had here in 1860. One side absolutely did not trust the other side, just in general. They were coming from two different value systems, two different cultures. There was already this huge mistrust. There were fights in Congress between Northern Congress people and Southern Congress people, you see? And you had a couple of other issues that occurred in the midst of all of this. The Dred Scott decision one, we could do an entire hour and a half on the Dred Scott decision, you see, about slaves' rights versus their non-rights. And I think we should do a whole class on the Dred Scott decision. Okay, I'll come back to this in a minute because I don't want to go too horizontal on that. All right. And another one is this book that was published called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a fantastic bestseller, by the way. I mean, it was like a huge bestseller and gave people this very emotional kind of portrayal of what it was like to be a slave, right? And this tied into the evangelicalism, right? The evangelicalism. And really it was like, we can't allow this to stand. How can we allow this to stand? We have to do something. We have to be more motivated to go and affect change, right? This era had a lot of people in it that today we would call activists, right? And a lot of people from the North, and the legacy of the New England particularly was one of creating a real epicenter of these activists, anti-slavery activists, right? Otherwise known as abolitionists. you see. And we were going down south, just like I was a little too young to remember this, but I watched movies, later on, like Mississippi Burning, if you've ever seen that, with William Dafoe, etc. And so you had these northern activists going down, and they were, just trying to help Black people vote and all the rest of that. And that the kind of threat that the Southern people felt as that was. Right. I mean, it wasn't like these kids even, it didn't matter about the kids. It's more like what they represented. You see, a lot of this gets muddled, but there was great passion about this slavery issue, great passion. But the war didn't start because of slavery. It started because of the states' rights issue. That is what really angered the South. The fact that the North and the other predominant people had the nerve to tell the South, as individual states, what to do. And the South didn't act in unison right away, It was South Carolina, and then a handful of other Southern states followed. And all but 2 of the slaveholding states followed suit, actually 3 of the slaveholding states, you see, but they didn't just happen right away. You see, the states considered themselves, especially in the South, to be that Jeffersonian point of view of we are sovereign. We're like our own country, and we have every right and every authority to govern ourselves as the federal government. As a matter of fact, more than the federal government, because it was the states that created the federal government on the state's behalf. Now, this isn't something we usually think about in these terms today. Right? We think of the terms, I mean, certainly during my lifetime, it's always seemed as though the states were like these, I don't know, this collection of sub-governmental entities to the federal government. You see, and you had different license plates and all the rest of that stuff. But, it wasn't a lot of differences between, I mean, it wasn't like the state of New York, where I grew up, where the state of Connecticut, where I live now, was standing up and saying, well, we're sovereign and we're going to do what we want. Only when when you feel like you're in the minority does that happen. And look at the kind of tension that we have in our states between the federal government now, right? If a state feels as though the federal government is getting too pushy, then, they're pushing back with as much authority as they can bear. Right? And you can see several examples of this. And unfortunately, this gets overlapped with the misuse of the federal system as we perceive it, like in the civil rights era, when the federal government, like President Eisenhower had to send troops down into the South so Black people can go to school and all the rest of that. So today, when we think about individual states' rights, it's usually conflated with, it's got something nefarious to do with, well, why are you oppressing people? And the federal government is always going to be in the right, because we compare it to what happened in the 1950s and the 1960s, generally speaking, in the Deep South. But here, in 1860, the Southern states felt like they were holding up for what they signed up for when they signed and ratified the Constitution of the United States. Now, the Republican Party was an outgrowth of the Whig Party. And the Republican Party, well, it elects Abraham Lincoln. Now, the Republican Party stood for the abolition of slavery. It stood for the abolition of slavery. But Abraham Lincoln, even though that was on the platform, Abraham Lincoln wasn't trying for the abolition of slavery. Abraham Lincoln was chosen president because, certainly on the Republican side, he was the more moderate of the candidates, right? And moderate means that you're not too far to the extreme. You're sort of like in the middle which is always a relative term. I mean, just use today's politics as an example. All of these different terms are thrown around. I mean, what is a moderate? What is a liberal? What is a conservative? What is a far leftist? What is an alt-right person? You know, all of these are relative terms. But in that particular time, then in 1860, a lot of people in the North felt like Abraham Lincoln wasn't going to be forceful enough to bring slavery to an end, because that wasn't his position. His position was holding the Union together. And his position was, I mean, if he could have kept the Union together without freeing one single slave, Abraham Lincoln would have done it. He said so. So some people felt like he wasn't enough of an abolitionist. And others, of course, if you were in the South, saw the fact that a Republican president was elected, whoever it was enough of a shot across the bow, so to speak, to put the Southern states on notice that the rest of the country wants your lifestyle gone, right? And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That's why this was so important. The election of 1860. Now, look at our own elections, the last few elections that we've had, especially the last two elections that we had. You know, for people who were like, oh my God, we've got to make sure Donald Trump doesn't get elected again. I mean, that wasn't just their opinion. You know, they felt passionately about that Donald Trump was an existential danger to the country and to the world and to the environment and to so many different things. I mean, it was a moral imperative that all stops be removed to get rid of him. And that's that kind of passion here. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, it was the Southern states were like, oh my God, we can't let this stand. We have to immediately go into this massive state of resistance. Right now, South Carolina took it to the extreme degree, and they basically just said, we're getting the hell out of here. You see? But the Southern states, my point is, they saw it, the North, and the election of Abraham Lincoln as the provocation, as the threat to their well-being, to their entire existence. And they had to fight what they perceived as that wrong, that immorality. And therefore, we are going to push back with everything that's in us. And South Carolina secedes from the Union, or tries to secede from the Union. You know, they de-ratify their acceptance of the Constitution. So they basically said, you know, we're lowering a lifeboat and we're out of here. And then several states followed, you see, and then they created their own Confederate States of America, and they sat there with a copy of the United States Constitution, and they basically erased the parts that said the United States of America, and they replaced it with Confederate States of America. And then they added a bunch of clauses, as you might imagine, that says slavery is fine, you see, and you're not allowed to make it go away. You know, that was it. You know, they had something to work with. The people who wrote the original Constitution, they had to start from scratch. So, yeah, the telegraph, of course, makes all of this news go back and forth a lot faster, right? Certainly during the time of, you know, 1860 and all the rest of that, you know. And then, of course, you have the demagoguery of the news and the press and everything else like that, fanning the flames one way or the other. The newspapers in the South and the newspapers in the North did their best to demonize their counterparts, you know, and that's always a big thing. By this point in time, we have more literate people than we've ever had probably in the entire history of the world. You know, that's another thing that we usually don't talk about is rates of literacy, you know, and especially in the 20th century, or the early 20th century, we have people being able to read, at least on a basic level, even with a high school education, or less. And that was the first time in history that you had like a mass population like us, like in the United States, that really had a decent literacy rate. So this was now created something called mass media, and you could actually influence an entire body politic through advertising, through political expression, through cartoons, through newspapers. And back in those days, you had newspapers that were just, they were conservative newspapers. They were liberal newspapers, right? And of course, the terms conservative and liberal have varying meanings as well. All right, but just to make a point. And, having to do with that evangelicalism of the Second Great Awakening, it led to this movement where we wanted to have an educated people because it was the right thing to do. And that's one of the things that actually led to what became in the early 20th century in our country, which was an excellent education system. I always felt like probably the high school education that people of my parents' age received was probably at least the equivalent to the college education of somebody of my age. You may disagree with that. So I'm going to open it up for a couple of questions. All right, it is just after 3 o'clock. I've laid a lot of stuff on the table. And let's see if we've got any comments at this point or questions, whether it's for today or from last time. Anything so far?
In the chat, but if anybody wants to put something into the chat,
right.
You can also use that raise hand feature and we can help you unmute, but also feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one.
Yep. So the, like I said to you before, Abraham Lincoln was not seeking to make the southern states give up slavery, right? This war started because the northern people under Abraham Lincoln felt as though he wanted to keep the Union together. And there were plenty of people in the South who didn't want to dissolve the Union either, okay? But it was a passionate thing. It was a passionate thing. And you had something that happened in the Civil War. It was the same thing that had happened in World War I, which was the last time it ever happened. And here's what I'm talking about. I mean, I'm just want to line this up a certain way because we've got to go into a different kind of framework. Before television and all the rest of this, warfare was seen as a highest embodiment of something virtuous, right? The ultimate expression of your going and doing and going to give even potentially the final measure of devotion, right? As Lincoln would say in the Gettysburg Address, to something that you believed in, that your community believed in, that people talked about in your church. You see, when the Civil War came up, especially in the South, people, they were falling over each other to enlist. This was going to be over fast. And what better embodiment of the best of me and my society and what I represent to go and defend our values. You see? Nobody had a vision that you were going to be laying there in the mud, freezing, and to the left of you, there was going to be a dead person with his intestines splattered all over the place. And this guy over here, where his arm and leg blown off. You see, that kind of gritty reality was something that didn't set in until the romanticism was gone. If you've ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, there's a scene at the beginning of the movie where these kind of like Southern aristocrat types were there, And they were in marked contrast to the kind of hard-boiled, cynical Rhett Butler, right? And everyone was like, this is going to be grand, and we're going to show those Yankees a thing or two. And by the very virtue of our nobleness, right? The nobleness of our cause, we are going to go and whip those Yankees, you see? And Rhett Butler was like, not so fast. This isn't going to be exactly what you think it's going to be. And of course, he got panned for that, you see. And this was a very important part of like the verve. A couple of years into this, it was a whole different story, of course, but it took you that time to figure it out. And what I meant by World War I is you had the same sort of thing. People went off and they were like, this is going to be grand. We're going for God and country. And, and within a year, 2 years, it was this unbelievable bloodbath that seemed to any sane person to be meaningless. You see, but that wasn't the way you started. You started in this for king and for country. As a matter of fact, World War I is a watershed in modern history. Probably the biggest watershed in modern history. Now, I know that's a large statement because World War I smashed that romantic notion of God and country and king, and we're going for this noble thing, the world was completely different after World War I. But here in the Civil War, people still went to war like that. It was a different era than the one we live in today, where it was still, you had these chivalry and, and you were doing the right thing, and, people were smacking each other with leather gloves and walking 20 paces with dueling pistols and things like that. There was a lot of honor, and you could draw a straight line from those times right to today, and where everything essentially is, you're skeptical of it, and maybe people should be skeptical of it. But there is no difference between the people who lived in these times and us. Only the circumstances are different and the technology is different. All right. This business of the Mexican-American War is very important also. All right. And incidentally, I don't know if you know this, but this notion of secession, right? It's always there buzzing around in the background. Is California going to secede from the Union? Is Texas going to secede from the Union? Right? And it's like this, almost like this taboo thing. Well, you're not allowed to do that. And then of course there's people who don't like the values in Texas or the values in California. You're saying, please secede, get the hell out of here. That sort of a thing. I'm tired of, through my federal tax dollars, subsidizing what you're doing, right? So you all know people like that if you hadn't had the thought yourself, and that's right now, and in New England actually was talking about seceding at one point. There was the War of 1812, which most New Englanders were against, and also certainly the Mexican-American War, 1836. New England was like, we're not giving tax dollars, federal tax dollars, to support these things, and we're out of here. Of course, that didn't happen, you see. But the Mexican-American War fit into the notion of manifest destiny. That is, that the entire continent moving west was, I guess, determined by God to be ours for the taking, and this gets sticky because now it's a rationalization for squashing everything in the path of our conquest of the continent to California, to the Pacific Ocean, with all of the atrocities and other tragedies that incurred, not only ecologically, but also ethnically. And I don't have to explain this to you. You know what I'm talking about. So that kind of gives God a bad name if that's the case. So if you've got manifest destiny, and it's your destiny that's manifest, in other words, God has determined that we have this continent, then that winds up giving God bad name because we squashed everything in the path to get there, right? So that can be another discussion. And but we wound up with a lot of territory after the Mexican-American War. There's something that a lot of people don't really understand much about the Mexican-American War. The 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, is something that people don't know much about, and the impact it had. And certainly the Mexican-American War, where we essentially wound up with a whole bunch of states, right? Eventually, a whole new territory in the Southeast, including California. And so on steroids, it pushed the issue about what was going to happen to these states. What was going to happen to those states? So here's another thing that just threw lighter fluid on everything that we were just talking about, well, are the new states going to be free states or are they going to be slave states? You see? And the stakes got higher. It was the same exact argument, but the stakes got higher. Right? And it was during those times where the Whig Party actually turned into the Republican Party, because the stakes got higher and people now can't be in a position of compromise, although there were those who wanted to compromise. If one side was evil and the other side wasn't, and you were on the side that you perceived that wasn't, then the other side's got to go. Like so many things we have today. Right now, I don't think there's anybody in this presentation today who was saying, well, we should have compromised on slavery, and it's, well, let those states have slaves. I mean, from today's standpoint, or certainly from my entire life experience, I don't know anybody who was in favor of slavery. Okay, certainly not chattel slavery or anything else like that. You see, but back in the 1840s, the 1850s, it was, what are we going to do? What would be the humane thing to do with former slaves if they were to become former slaves? So let's say the abolitionists from the North had their way and slavery was abolished, which was never going to happen without a civil war, I guess. I mean, what were you going to do with those slaves? You see, because the irony here is that people in the North, even the abolitionists, didn't want the slaves living in their neighborhood either. You see what I mean? Well, maybe some of them, you know what I mean? Like people who really walk the walk, so you had certain people who were really walking the walk and they treated people like God's equal creatures, you see. But by far, the majority of people in the North didn't want a Black person living in the house next to them, out there mowing his lawn while you're out there mowing your lawn. So you may have wanted the institution of slavery gone, but you didn't want to have the Black people walking around as your equals either. You see, so this is actually a truism. So they were talking about doing things like, maybe we'll send them back to Africa. This sort of thing. We could do 100 presentations on every single thing we're talking about here. But the election of 1860 was the tipping point. And the Republican platform said that we are for the eradication of slavery. So even though Abraham Lincoln, who he himself was not advocating for Southern states to have to give up their slaves, only that the new federal territories were not going to be slave territories. That was enough for the South. because that itself indicated that the South's days were numbered. And so the South was going to essentially break up, right? Well, I'm going to get out of here before you can hurt me. Right? We're going to hold on to what we got here and make the best of it on our own, while before we allow you, the North, to take away our way of life. That's what the secession was. For the South, that's what the Civil War was about, right? None of this was about, we are fighting to eradicate slavery. It was to save the Union. And as I mentioned last time, even during the Emancipation Proclamation, didn't call for the abolition of slavery right off. All of a sudden, slaves didn't become free. It was different with we'll talk about this in a future lecture, but it only became a cause after the fact, right? The slavery thing only became a cause after the fact. An interesting question would be like, what if there wasn't a Civil War? And what if, I don't know, there was some kind of a compromise where the rest of the states moving towards the Pacific Ocean were, somehow neutral, if that's even possible in an argument like this, or they weren't slaveholding states, at least. And the southern states remained slaveholding states. What would have happened? Would have just fizzled out, right? Would the urbanization of the North, driven by technological advances, have just seeped its way into the South, and eventually slavery would have gone away? You can consider how technology in our lifetimes has affected the cultural habits of places where at one time it was insulated from, right? That starts especially with the internet. The internet finally brought everywhere in the country right into your own computer screen, you see. So you have people in some part of the country that might seem remote from an urban center, and now a young man or a young woman is wearing their hat on backwards, or they're emulating things that they see on the internet, which beforehand they probably wouldn't have had the exposure to. Speaking in certain languages, certain kind of dialects, and other things that are trendy in one place or the other. Back in those days, of course, in 1860, we didn't quite have that, but it wasn't a long time off either. We were already in the second industrial revolution. We already have trains. We already have the telegraph. We already have certain things. So if slavery was there to persist, another question would be, could the United States have sustained that? Was the Civil War absolutely inevitable? Was there some way that there could have been a compromise? But like I said to you before, we were in the same position then as we are now, where our moral values, one way or the other, literally makes the other side completely intolerant. Completely intolerant. It's got to go. It has to be canceled. You see? There's no compromise. There's no middle ground. And I'm not suggesting on a topic like slavery that there should be a middle ground. Right? There is no way that I'm advocating that, well, so it was just in a few states in the South and we can live with that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just being hypothetical about it and a little bit academic. Most people thought that without the Civil War, as I said to you in the beginning of our lecture, that slavery would have been completely unsustainable, that it just would have fizzled out, right? That, and we'll see this also, because if the South had actually been recognized as its own country, right, which it was desperately trying to do during the Civil War, but other countries which may have come to the aid of recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate government, the way that France had recognized the government of the United States of America after the Declaration of Independence, that to do so to the Confederacy would have aligned yourself, whatever country that was, with the institution of slavery, which already had tremendous political ramifications around the world. You see, so you can't just go and recognize the Confederacy, because if you recognize the Confederacy and you're doing business with the Confederacy, it means that you, whatever country you are, must support slavery. You see, and a political decision like that from you, whatever country you are, is going to have ramifications in your own country. You see, so it seemed as though in general, by this point in time, right, the middle part of the 19th century, that the concept of ownership of people was in fact passé. It's not to say that there was going to be equality. It's not to say that there was going to be complete freedom. Of course, we went from at the end of the Civil War, we went straight into Jim Crow, which was like, well, fine, you're not a slave anymore, but don't tell me you're my equal. And, you know, we're going to institute things to keep you from becoming my equal, or letting you think that you ever have the nerve to consider yourself my equal. You know, but there is more to these arguments than even just slavery. I mean, as far as constitutionally is concerned, the 14th Amendment, etc., Black men on paper were free and could vote as citizens of the United States. But still, white women, equally citizens, did not get the right to vote until, what was it, 1920? 19th Amendment? Well, let's not forget women. So to understand ourselves today, we have to understand these times to see where the country went. I think one of the most important parts of our presentation series is going to be during the period of Reconstruction, because it's another thing that is highly misunderstood or not understood at all, in my opinion. We really don't know how we got here. We just, you know, make these quick assumptions, like these quick, you know, cheat notes about, well, this is what happened here, and this is what happened here, and this is what happened here. We need to look at it a little bit closer if we understand ourselves and how we all got here. Reconstruction was a very, very difficult thing to do. I mean, you might say that we were never really reconstructed. I mean, see, the Civil War was like, you can say that the United States never lost a war. I mean, certainly before Vietnam, you could say that. But the Americans did lose a war, right? When America lost the Civil War in the South, it was Americans who lost the Civil War, you see? And you had an entire part of our country that had suffered the ignominy of defeat. I mean, defeat. Way of life over, what you were fighting for over, dominance by that which you hated, the North, and everything that the North stood for, which was exacerbated and made worse because of all of the worst fears of the stereotypes that you had about the North. People from the North came down, carpetbaggers, to exploit and took everyone's greatest fear and turned it into a reality. You know, and the federal government tried whatever it could to try and pull the South back into the Union, right up until Wilson's term. We were desperately trying to reincorporate the Southern states back into the Union, sort of like as if nothing happened, you see? And it was very, very, very awkward thing to do. And we're literally still suffering the consequences of it. It was never really, it was like, I'll tell you something, there's a rule that is called the can of worms rule. And I don't know if you've ever heard this before. Once you open a can of worms, right? Those worms that are now squirming around on the floor, if you wanted to put those back in the can, they will never fit in the same size can that they came out of. That's the worm rule. You can use that if you want to. Okay, you need a bigger can now. You see, they will never fit back in the same size can they came out of. And that's kind of like what Reconstruction was. It ain't going back the way it was. There are some things that get broken that ain't going back together quite right. Now, a long time has passed since the Civil War, but you can imagine the kind of shadow this has cast. The South lost everything. They lost their economy, they lost their way of life, they lost their all of the things that they believed superior, that they were superior to, their what they had invested themselves in, let alone a generation of men. You know, more people were lost fighting the Civil War. They were lost cumulatively in all the other wars that we fought as Americans. And if America had been the South had seceded, right? And what would the United States have looked like after that? If the United States had said, okay, well, the Southern states, you know, they want to go, and that's kind of a shame, but see you later, right? So if you had the Confederate States of America that actually was allowed to stand, or was able to sustain itself against the Union trying to reincorporate them, or have them lose, essentially. With the United States, what would the history of the United States after the Civil War look like? Would we have been a unified country that did what we normally consider ourselves to be, have done good things in regards of, like, you know, fighting World War I and fighting World War II? Would we have been able to do that? Probably not. Fascinating questions. You know, one more thing before we go. The Great Second Awakening created this movement, and it was big in churches and everything else like that. You see, now, certainly in the North, where this became so fervent, you know what the majority of the people who became activists were? Women. So really, the first time in the early part of the 1800s, you had the first, I would say, first women's movement, right? Later on, you had different, you know, conventions and different things with famous activists for women's rights. That's when this occurred, right? And many of the people who were actually so emotional about the right thing to do about the abolition of slavery were women. And they transmitted that message, and they were a force. And I can't discount that enough. It's usually something we gloss over during these periods of time. But women were a very, very strong force in the abolition movement. And this was really the first time that you saw real women's advocacy. Because, you know, traditionally, culturally, not just in this country, but elsewhere, you know, women were not encouraged to be so outgoing and outspoken. And this is another thing that really, really helped to push this abolitionist movement, that gave it the fever pitch that it had. And I don't mean fever pitch in a negative way. Okay, I mean it in a positive way. Anyway, so you can see that there's a lot on the plate. The election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln's president, the writings on the wall. Us southern states are going to have to protect ourselves now against what is going to guaranteed be, if not now, if not tomorrow, that in 5 years and 10 years, certainly, they are going to put the pressure on the South to give up our entire way of life. We're out of here. We're seceding from the Union. That's my lecture for you today. Thank you.
If
I
anybody
hope you
has
enjoy.
any questions, you can put them into that chat box. You can also feel free to shoot me an email. I am the one that sends out all of those Zoom invitations. So if you just reply to the last Zoom invitation, don't reply all, just reply and shoot me a question. I can get all of those over to Arthur. In 2 weeks, we have industrialized North versus agrarian South on December 1st. As I've mentioned before, if you receive the Zoom invitation for this program, you will just continue to receive those invitations for the rest of the program. So if there's one session that you can't make, don't cancel out your registration. You could just not show up for that day and I'll continue sending those to you. A huge thank you to Arthur for being with us here today, and thank you to the Friends of the Library and the Monroe Historical Society for sponsoring these programs. Does anybody have any questions before we sign off? You can also unmute yourself or turn on your video. And if not, that's the end of our program for today. Again, feel free to send me those emails and I'll get them all over to Arthur. I'm going to stop the recording now.